This lecture is called The Elements of Fiction. We'll begin by discussing why we read literature. These are some highlights from the reading. One reason we read literature is because we are what Joseph Campbell describes as narrative beings. In other words, we find deep satisfaction in giving and receiving stories. Campbell also says this is, quote, the characteristic pleasure of the human mind, end quote. Just as there are excellent reasons to keep fit, it's imperative that we work out our minds and imaginations through the exercise of reading. We are not mere empty receptacles ready to be filled with information, but living beings who are inspired by literary encounters to explore and transform ourselves. Even painful or tedious textual encounters helps us to better understand our deepest desires, aspirations, and anxieties. Many of you may know author C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia Chronicles. For him, literary encounters can be pivotal. He says, quote, the first reading of some literary work is often, for the literary, an experience so momentous that only experiences of love, religion, or bereavement can furnish a standard of comparison. Lewis also writes, each of us by nature sees the whole world from one point of view. We want to see with other eyes, to imagine with other imaginations, to feel with other hearts as well as our own. In this next slide, we're going to go over the characteristics of the short story. So you guys will need to remember these or take notes on them. I will ask you about the characteristics of short stories on our midterm exam. So these characteristics are really the things that make a short story a short story. And so since we'll be studying short story for the first half of the semester, all of you will need to understand kind of what goes into making it a short story. So here they are. First, it's a particular literary genre. It's a short fictional prose narrative, so shorter than a novel, but it's going to be longer, for example, than a poem. Prose meaning it's it's written like standard English rather than poetry. Fiction meaning it's imagined, right? It's not based on a real story. It involves one unified episode, unlike a novel which may have several interwoven stories together. This is going to focus on one episode. Shows rather than tells, so authors strive to get readers to experience the same things the characters are experiencing, and they don't try to tell us a moral. They try to have us live vicariously through the characters. So we also learn alongside the characters. Next, there's a concentrated use of language that relies on feeling and suggestion. So remember, we're also developing emotional intelligence in the course. Short stories can help us do that. And lastly here, it's the author's subjective response. So in other words, it's written from the author's personal point of view. All right, so now we're going to get to the literary elements. So each one of these in the next several slides focus on one particular literary term and its definition. And so these are the words I want you guys using in our discussions about literature. Every subject has its own terminology, and literature is no exception, right? So we're learning these terms and their definitions to help with our discussions, and also you guys will be tested on these for the midterm as well. So the first one is plot. It refers to the sequence of events in a story and their relation to one another as they resolve a conflict. So we want to always think about not only what happened next, but also why. How are these events related? What's causing things to turn out the way they're turning out? all parts of the plot are unified, and we have what's called end orientation. So if you were to go back and reread the story knowing the ending, you would see that everything builds toward it. So everything in the opening paragraphs is already hinting toward that conclusion. So what we mean by end orientation is the outcome of the action of the plot is inherent in the opening paragraphs. A story arc, you guys probably have seen this in another English class before, but it refers to the kind of arc, a line. It looks like a line, right? And then on each part of the line, as it arcs upward and then back downward, we have one part of the story kind of filling in that arc. So we start with the exposition. That's going to be at the bottom and the very beginning of the arc. So it's the first line, right? The beginning of the line that's kind of arching upward. So this is exposition is where we get background information. So setting, characters, scene, situation. In a short story, we usually learn these things in the first paragraph. As the line moves upward, we have what's called rising action. So the conflict intensifies, right, and develops. We have complications that lead to the climax. So the climax will be the turning point or the point of highest interest in a narrative. It's going to be at the very top of our story arc. This is the point at which the most important part of the action takes place and the final outcome becomes inevitable. Next, our arc starts to slope downward, right? And we have what's called falling action. So the events of a narrative that follow the climax and begin to resolve the conflict are what we would call falling action. And now, of course, at the very end of our story arc, now we're back kind of to a straight line. The end is called the conclusion, also called the denouement. This is the outcome or resolution of a plot at the end of a story. So denouement literally means the untying of a knot. So if you think of the conflict in a story as a knot, by the end, hopefully, it's resolved, though not always. Foreshadowing is basically the author giving us hints about the outcome of a story. So there will be an introduction of specific words, images, or events to suggest or anticipate later events that are central to the story and to the resolution of the story. Allusion refers to a reference that the author is making, and it's something with which the reader is supposed to be familiar with. So it could be a reference to a historical event or figure, to another work of literature, to a geographical location. So anything you come across in a story that you've never heard of, that you're unfamiliar with, you guys should look them up, right? So that's an allusion with an A, right, as opposed to illusion with an I. Irony, I know a lot of us, we probably in our heads know what irony is, but it's kind of difficult to define. So here's a definition. It's the reader's or audience's awareness of a reality that differs from the reality the characters perceive. That's what we call dramatic irony. Or it can be the audience's awareness of the literal meaning, the difference between the literal meaning of the author's words and what the author really means. Okay, so we call that verbal irony. So if you guys think of sarcasm, that's an extreme form of verbal irony, right? Someone says one thing and they actually mean the opposite. Character, of course, refers to the people who are involved in a story. So we can have different types of characters. I want you guys to know these terms. Static versus dynamic characters. So static characters are ones that don't change. No matter what happens to them in the story, they stay the same. Dynamic characters are people who are going to be transformed by the events in the story. And when we look at their behaviors and their thoughts in the beginning compared to the end, you'll see that they're different people. So then we would say they're dynamic characters. We also have what are called flat and round characters. So flat characters are going to be one-dimensional, simple. They don't have a great impact in a story. Versus round characters who feel a lot more lifelike, like real human beings. They'll be complex, multi-dimensional, and very vividly described. The setting refers to the place and time of the story. It suggests the scene and presents a mood or an atmosphere. Often symbolically reflects the character's internal state. Now, point of view, we can have a lot of different kinds of point of view, but it refers to the author's choice of a narrator for the story. So we want to always really look closely at the story and not necessarily trust who's telling it. Sometimes we can have what's called an unreliable narrator. Maybe the narrator is falling into insanity, or he or she can't see the truth of what's happening. So when we're reading, we have to be really careful with, looking at the words and what's happening in the story versus who's telling it. So we have a couple different types of point of view. One is called first-person narration. So this is a person who's in the story, and they're going to be using, if we've got a first-person narrator, they're going to use the pronoun I. Okay, so it could be a major or minor character. If we have third-person narration, it's someone's telling the story who's not actually a participant, and we'll have the pronouns he, she, or they. So we can have a third-person omniscient narrator. This type of narrator sees into the minds of all of the characters. A limited omniscient narrator sees into only one or a few of the characters' minds. A third-person objective narrator is going to see into none of the characters' minds. It's more like the narrator is filming the scene, right? And they're reporting the action and the dialogue from a detached perspective, exactly as it would be seen or heard, right? If we had a camera on the action. Okay, style refers to the characteristic way an author uses language. So for example, if you guys have read Hemingway, he uses a very direct conversational style. Versus Faulkner, who maybe starts a sentence on one page and then it's very flowery, very complex, and that one sentence could go on for 3 or more pages, right? So it's the very unique way each author expresses himself or herself. Tone conveys the author's unstated attitudes toward his or her story, subject, or theme. So if you're looking at tone, you want to ask yourself how the author might feel about this character and what's happening in the story. A symbol refers to anything in the story's setting, plot, or characterization that suggests an abstract meaning to the reader in addition to its literal significance. So something in the story, if the author keeps drawing attention to it or emphasizing it, and it seems like it means more than just what it literally appears to be in the story, then it might be a symbol. Theme, which we'll be looking at for every story that we study, is a generalization about the meaning, right? So if we're thinking of what the overall point of a story is, then we're thinking about theme. So I want to explain that it's different than the topic or subject of a story. We could say, this story is about death, or this story is about coming of age, or this story is about love. So if we're talking about the subject or topic, it can be expressed in a word or a phrase. The theme, however, is not going to be just a word or a phrase. It's going to be at least a sentence or two. It's what does the story say about the topic or the subject? So this story might be about love, okay, but if you're giving a statement of theme, you want to explain what you think this story tells us about love. What message does it convey? All right. Another way of describing theme is the central unifying point or idea that is developed and explored in a story. Okay, these next few slides give you some advice, some strategies for actively reading literature. This can help you guys when you're studying. So you want to really think about how you're reading literature. It's a little bit different than other types of reading. So in order to appreciate what literature can reveal about humanity, its history, and its prospects, it is necessary to take the time to explore or analyze works of literature. You become engaged in a conversation with the author, a conversation that expands when you discuss the literary work in class, read articles about the work, and eventually write a paper about it. So we've got 2 stages of active reading. We'll kind of go over these in a little bit more detail, but preliminary reading and annotating the text. Okay? So when you're doing preliminary reading, I highly recommend that you read each of these stories at least twice. But when you do a preliminary reading, that's going to be your first reading. You're really trying to get just a general sense of what it's about. Think about your prior knowledge, right? What is it that you maybe already know? Do you know anything about the historical context surrounding the story? Biographical information about the author. I include bios with each story that we read. Maybe you have a personal experience that is related to what's happening in the story. So anything that's relevant that you can use to help you connect and dive deeper into the story, you want to think about that ahead of time. Always ask questions, right? Asking and answering questions throughout the process, the reading process, will be very helpful. And I will be providing us with some good analytical questions to help us learn how to interpret. So our discussions will, they'll show you guys the kinds of questions we ask when we're studying literature. Annotating the text means marking it, right? So another thing I highly recommend is that you guys print out the stories and take notes. Underline significant words, phrases, and passages. If you have observations that you think are important or you have questions as you're reading, you can jot those down as well. Comment on the language. That's really what we're working with here, right? We're studying language and the way authors use language to express themselves through story. So look at images, look at descriptions, anything that's repeated you want to take note of. Similes, metaphors. Again, if you guys come across references, look them up, take notes on them. All of these things can help you understand stories better. Lastly, you want to comment on the characters. Really what we're studying here is human motivation when we're studying literature. So look at the personalities of the characters, pay attention to what they say, how they behave, even how they look, how they appear. All of those will also be helpful when you're trying to get a better understanding and interpret these stories. So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture. Make sure you guys study these terms and keep them in mind as we move through the semester.